and introduced our expert guest, I want to go over just a couple guidelines to make the sessions run efficiently. So we really want to hear your thoughts and questions during the presentation, and we're going to do this in two different ways. So you're welcome to tap the raise your hand button when you've got a question or a thought that you want to contribute, and then I will stop the speaker, and then you can unmute yourself and ask your question. But once you finish asking the question, then just go back on mute. The second way is that you can type your question in the chat box. I'm going to be monitoring that, and I have one of my colleagues, Michael, who's also going to help me with that. But unless you're asking a question, just go ahead and stay on mute so we can minimize any background noise. We are recording today's session, and we'll have that recording available on the Wond'ry's website a few hours to a day after the event. You're welcome to have your camera on. I know that that helps me when I feel like I have an audience when I'm speaking in these virtual kind of sessions, but I'll leave that up to you. If you do that, please don't take us to the restroom with you. If you're wearing boxers, just don't stand up. You know, I think we've all seen those videos come across in the last few weeks. I don't know if you can see this, but I put on my Tux t-shirt for you all here today just for a little bit of fun. This is a really serious topic. We're all in this together as we're making real decisions for our companies and for our lives. But I really want you to feel welcome and empowered to ask any questions that you have while we have these experts on the line with us. So I would like to introduce our host and speaker, El-Husseini. So besides being just a close friend and mentor of mine and a really great supporter of the Wond'ry, Amar's a global venture capitalist and corporate strategist. He's worked across 5 continents in corporate development, venture capital, turnaround and transformation, business strategy, innovation and entrepreneurship, international expansion, and investment banking. And he currently works with clients and portfolio companies on growth through innovation, international expansion, transformation, and investments. And prior to founding Lodestone, he served in several capacities where he's been responsible for international operations and strategic investments covering markets stretching from the UK all the way to Malaysia. He's led a number of successful turnarounds and restructuring, in addition to the development and execution of international expansion strategies. He's a graduate of Harvard Business School's General Management program, and he also has an MBA from the University of Wales and a BS in Finance and Accounting. So with that, Amar, I'm going to let you take it away.
Dina, thank you so much. Everyone, welcome. Thank you for joining us today. I'm very, very, very pleased today to be joined by 2 very special and dear guests. I have 2 people that are changing the world every day in their own industries, and they are amazing, great friends. Dr. Colm Reilly is, besides being a senior advisor to Lodestone, he's a very good friend, and he's one of the globe's leading experts on strategy, focusing on specifically innovation and commercialization and economic development. He's worked across the world with countless companies, governments, and advised on how to create knowledge economies, how to move into digital economies, how to move into the economies of the future, basically. He's also a serial entrepreneur himself, started multiple companies, successful and operated, as I said, all over the world. I'm also joined by a very dear friend of mine and classmate, Magdalena Dziewguć. She's currently leading Central European operations for Google Cloud, multiple countries, but she's technically a digital transformation expert, digital leader, and more than a serial entrepreneur. I can't say enough about how lucky we are today to have both of them, and I'd like to welcome both of you to today, and thank you for taking the time to be with us. I want to start by just very, very quickly talk about what we've covered so far. This is our 3rd session. So far, we've talked in details about the shape of the global economy. This is evolving every day, so this is why we do a snapshot every week to give an update on that. We're talking about government responses. We're talking about businesses. We're talking about especially entrepreneurs, small businesses, and transformation across the board. There are a lot of bad news, as everyone is seeing, but there are a lot of opportunities, and we want to try and highlight a lot of these opportunities that are allowing, I think, the recovery and allowing the next transformation or the next shift in global business. Please feel free to raise your hand, ask questions, be as engaged as you want to. We'd love to hear from you. We'd love to be interrupted. Dina will be assigning the, I think, the questions and stopping us when there's anything. We also covered the status or the state of financial markets, what's going on, the overreaction to the unknown, to the uncertainty over the first couple of weeks, how that started changing a little bit. But now we're looking at a longer term impact, and this is the lagging impact from economic output being reduced and not able to pick up once this is over, from transformation of a lot of businesses, from cash flow challenges. We talked specifically about startups and medium-sized businesses, how much cash on average they hold on hand, what do they do in times like that, what are the opportunities. We talked about how do we respond to changes like that in our business, in our community, as a government. One major change in the globe that happened between 2008 and 2016, following the global recession that happened, is the impact on geographical locations. And I would just start by saying, giving a couple of numbers. The US economy, as a reference, produced about 16 million jobs during that time. Out of these 16 million jobs, less than 1% were for rural America. Rural America hosts probably 40% of the population. They only got a tiny little portion of that economic growth. And those jobs were created specifically for the higher educated meaning college educated and above. Non-college educated were the most impacted through that. How is that new crisis going to impact the world, and how it's going to change governments' minds on how do we create growth instead of buying growth? This is something that we see every day in our business. When we talk about innovation and entrepreneurship and creating ecosystems, and the focus of governments on using more traditional methods to attract jobs instead of creating their own and transforming their own economies. Without further ado, I'd like to start the session. Colm, I see your name. I don't think the camera is on. Please feel free to, okay, great. So this is back to you, Colm. Thank you for joining. And I will be interrupting when I think I have questions or somebody from the audience is asking something.
Thank you for inviting me along to talk today. I guess I don't have everybody asks me if I have a definitive view on what's going to happen next, but I don't. But I want to share with you some ideas about observations I think I can see and impacts that that I think are already coming out of industry, both large and small. And I want to talk about the reason I entitled this talk Defamiliarization is that if you go back a long time in the evolution of industry, the time when innovation has been most required is typically in a time of defamiliarization. And what I mean by defamiliarization is that when you're in a situation where everything you have known is no longer going to work, you have to find other ways of doing it. And the main title that I'm giving to people when I talk now is when my children were much younger, anytime we're going anywhere, after about 7 minutes before the journey, before we'd even hit the motorway, they would always ask the question, "Are we there yet?" And what they were really anticipating was, have we got back to the place we know we're going to? Have we got to the place that we can feel that we're comfortable, that this car thing isn't working out for us? And the reality is that we're not going to be there yet, and we're not going to go back there anyway, because defamiliarization is going to stop that. And I'm going to talk a little bit about that. And then I'm going to talk about what it means for industries, but more importantly, what it means for innovation, because if you go back to 1880, when the US Patent Office recommended that it would shut down because there was nothing else to be discovered, and we look at the interleaving 140 years since then, you can see that it's at periods like this that you see the greatest amount of innovation. I'm going to give you a viewpoint on why that is. The takeaway I think we can come to at the moment, though, is that the COVID-19 scenario isn't over. It's not going to be over when it peaks. And people need to get an awareness around this. Right now, the time scale believed that you might get vaccines available will be in 2021, and that won't be available for the entire population. And the easing back to work, if it ever does happen, back to whatever normality will be, will take a long period of time. So there's going to be 3 stages of development on this yet. And we're only right now starting stage 1. So there's a way to go on this. But the second point related to what has COVID-19 done that other things didn't do is it has defamiliarized everything we know. If you think about the ordinary things of life that we have always shared with our communities and our families, you go to school, you go to secondary school, you go to university, you go to the office. Those things are now dangerous. You just can't do them anymore, and you're not allowed to do them anymore. The things we do socially, shaking hands, touching our faces, shrugging our shoulders, brushing up against each other, traveling together to work on congested public transport, all those normal connections are now done with. And it's a long way back before we start using them again, if we ever go back to using them the same way that we used to. And if people don't think that these changes will be portents of the future, I just want to give you a brief history of standing on buses and trains. Most people these days know that you stand on buses and trains, or at least we used to up this COVID crisis happened. Up until 1943, it was illegal to stand on buses and trains in the United States and in Europe, because it was deemed to be unsafe. It was only during the Second World War that they relaxed this behavioral pattern, and yet it remained in place thereafter, and it remained a way of planning mass transportation for many years outside of airspace, of course. So the point I'm making is that things change in these environments, and they don't go back to what they were for an awful long time. Interestingly, I think we're also in a world where long distance is now at stake. So distances, geographical distances that we thought were shrinking. In some ways, traveling there physically is an issue because that's how the virus spread. But also, ironically, proximity is a problem. If I'm less than 2 meters away from you, this is what we say in Europe, it's an issue. And if you're not in my unit, I can't be less than 2 meters away from you. So what you're going to see there is a little bit of back to the future in terms of how we engage with each other, both socially, but also as businesses. Point 4 of my takeaway is really a very interesting observation I want to make, and I hope that Magna might be able to brush on this later on about digitalization, because in a way, many organizations are trying to make adaptations to how they're working today to survive during this COVID-19 period, and that's been very important and very good. The irony of the situation is that the better they are at this right now, the greater degree of change they're going to experience post the crisis of whatever form it is. And let me give you 3 very interesting examples on that. The first example I would pick is that in the UK, and by the way, all of my terms of reference are European based. I should stress that. I know you're predominantly a US audience, but all of my terms of reference are European based. They've talked about moving secondary exams to continuous assessment out of mass study halls and out of mass one-shot examinations and into continuous assessments and review of project works. And that's been underway for about 20 years, that conversation has been happening. And in less than a 6-week period, they've effectively decided to do that in a number of European countries this year. So although they've talked about it for 20 years, they're going to be able to do it imperfectly in 6 weeks. And that'll just tell you what this situation has done. It has brought together a condensation of time. And it means that if you do these changes now and they work, you're not going to go back to the older model. That change has already been made. This is my equivalent of standing on buses back in 1943. You're not going to go back to saying everybody has to have a seat. You're going to be in a world where continuous assessment and other aspects in other sectors will be important. So I guess the point I'm coming to, Amber, if we can just go back up one more page for a second. innovation in its biggest is highest at the time of maximum defamiliarization, and we're in there right now. And on the second thing that we're starting to see is, if we could just go up the other page beforehand, I want to make a point before I come to this. Amber, if we go back up one page. Yeah, there are four fundamental changes that we see happening. The first is we're seeing that's it. Thank you. We're seeing reshaping of the developed world economy. And by that, I think it's very obvious is that we're going to shrink supply chains. We're not going to be using long distance supply chains as extensively anymore. We're going to see more localized manufacturing. But also, we're also starting to see people talk about who's really adding value in the economy and how are they being rewarded in the economy. Every Thursday night, folks, at 8 o'clock in the evening, a whole load of financial analysts and hedge fund managers in Chelsea and Kensington stand outside their front doors holding candles and applauding the shop workers, the truck drivers, and the NHS cleaners who keep their systems running over. The reality is that people are now starting to realize who adds the value to the economy. And you're starting to see economies take decisions on that basis that are going to be irreversible and going to change commercial models from here on out. How precisely they'll change them, I can't give you an answer on that yet, but we're going to see that change. The next time NHS workers have a 20% pay demand coming into, as healthcare workers, into the National Exchequer, I don't see it being turned down. And so we're going to see a rebalancing of the developed world economy. The shape of international trade and investment fundamentally altering now because trade is already down 30%. Some countries are already locking down investment. You can't buy certain assets in Spain and Italy and Germany anymore. You need to get a government license to do that. That was, by the way, eradicated 40 years ago. They're now protecting their national assets. So you're starting to see very significant shifts in how trade and investment will be carried out across the globe. The shape of the developing world economy will be both a moral and an imperative challenge to the world, because once the virus starts to move out of the wealthy north into the impoverished south, it's got to be addressed by the north to some extent or another. It has an obligation both morally and commercially to do this, because any defaults on those debt-laden economies will spread back up to the north, which no longer has the capacity to deal with defaults. And finally, I think we've got to accept that our society is changing. At least in Europe, I see it very much changing, where the appreciation of who does what and how it's done is starting to change a whole area of how we understand social discourse and how we're engaging. So, Amber, if we go to the next slide, the next page, and I won't go through all the detail on this. So I think innovation is going to be at its highest point. I think where we're going to see innovation work is somewhere around the area of where it understands a social requirement. And Amber raised a very interesting question earlier on when he talked about, since 2008, we've seen a concentration of trade and money being earned within the major metropolitan areas. Right now, the most important people in our national economies across Europe are farmers, because they're still producing goods and food that can be bought by people who need it to survive, whether you're in lockdown or not. And so we're going to start to see shifts in us understanding whether all that concentration of wealth into cities and all that concentration into particular segments was appropriate or not. And so innovation is going to start being much more broader in its context. It's going to be important in healthcare, of course, because we're starting to realize that if you don't have those systems in place, they don't work anyway. It's going to be important in education, because education will not allow that type of proximity anymore. But it's also going to be important in things like food processing, packaging, food production, and it's going to start to actually equalize out from the cities back into the rural areas. The core aspects of successful innovation are going to be around attitude. And by that, I mean, can you take risks? Can we appreciate failure? But also, can we embrace the lessons of this environment and understand that having stuff millions of miles away isn't always the best option? It's going to be also around history. Who's done it before and who's comfortable with finding solutions and experimenting with solutions. And by the way, if anybody wants to see a very interesting country doing this right now, just have a look at New Zealand. Although it doesn't get a lot of world press at the moment, New Zealand went early and hard on this. And if you look at what they're doing around new types of companies that are coming out of their environment based on what they've experienced from going hard so early, it's quite revolutionary. But even in food products, by the way, which will be exported. You need infrastructure, of course, but that infrastructure isn't always going to just be about universities anymore. It's going to be about the ability of transferring knowledge from one location to another, whether, no, irrespective of the size of the geography. So I might be living 2 blocks away from Amr, but I'm still socially isolated from him. So I can't go and meet him anyway, just the same way as he may be in Guangzhou and he still can't meet me because the distance is too large. But either way, there has to be an infrastructure that allows those exchange of ideas, findings, results. And we need to remember a core element to this, which is, if you go right back to the Industrial Revolution, and I quote an example of that in the slides, the reality is the greatest sustained achievements in humanity are always scientific in nature, even if that's applied to changing business models. It's always about the science. And I suppose we've spent 10 years maybe not being convinced that it's all about the science, but right now we're in a science-driven environment and we're going to stay there for some time. Capital is very important, obviously, and it will stay important. But the last thing I would say is the key driver is going to be talent. Who can think outside the box? Who understands the triangulation of time, quality, and money? And who's got the education, both at a scientific level and a commercial level, that allows them exploit ideas and make profitable and social returns with them? So I think this defamiliarization zone we're in at the moment is going change substantively how we engage socially and as a result of that commercially in the future. And if we go down to the last point, Amr, and I can go through this very quickly, certain industries are going to change more than others, and certain industries are going to be more open to these type of innovations than the other. And the next slide, I think, gives you a quick viewpoint on where I think they are. I think automotive is in real trouble. I wouldn't be betting the house on automotive at this point in time. The nature of transportation is going to change, and I think we're not going to expect that to change. By the way, just so you know, since the end of March, 2.5 million vehicles have been removed from the schedules worldwide. I don't think they'll ever be put back into those schedules. Aerospace is in real trouble. From my point of view, aerospace is going to be nationalized. Amr and I were just talking about this earlier this afternoon. I don't think airlines have the capacity to run themselves correctly. And I think we're going to see aerospace tightly regulated being moved back to a nationalized agenda. I think banking is in real trouble. And let me explain why I think banking is in real trouble. Commercial banks were bailed out in 2008 at the expense of the public, and they were allowed rebuild their bases, but they didn't redefine their operating models in time. One of the interesting things is governments try to parachute money down into their economies to safeguard them and just to keep them at an even keel, is that the banks can't do it. The banks actually are too slow in getting money back out into the economy. So what the national agencies are doing in a number of countries is they're saying, fine, we'll just find another way. And inadvertently, in finding another way, they're creating another level of a banking, a third wave of banking, if you will. And I think banking is going to experience tremendous change. The one thing I don't understand enough about personally is retail. But I know retail is never going to be the same again. I think the high streets are empty now. A lot of retailers will go to the wall. They will try to gaslight the public into thinking none of this happened and getting them back to shop again, but it's not going to happen. And I think the nature of retail is probably going to stay online with some better tool sets than it's had before. But retail as we know it is not going back. Food service, I think food service is starting to change as well. We're going to realize and appreciate the value of food service, particularly those who've shown have the resilience to pass through this opportunity. And you can go through the rest of the sectors yourself. What I've highlighted in the chart that I've shown there is the sectors where I think the change of COVID-19 is significant, but I don't understand what the impact will be other than it'll be trying to save an industry at some extent. And the ones I've marked as opportunity, which is the areas where I believe that there are substantive changes that the public will want to see and that will be driven by a certain amount of both commercial and societal demand. And I believe it is in those areas that the greatest amount of innovation will be taking place and the greatest amount of innovation will be demanded. And those are the markets that you're going to see change in. So you'll see it in pharma, you'll see it in healthcare, You'll see it in packaging, very obviously, because we want to see that things are safe. You'll see it in areas like mining. You'll see it in healthcare provision. One thing we've learned is that large hospitals with concentrated ICU units are struggling in the current environment. So we're going to have to figure out a new model of healthcare, of dispersing healthcare capability out. But here's an interesting thought. For many years, I've been arguing here locally that GPs shouldn't have to meet me face to face, that I should be able to go online and book a time with my GP, and the GP can look at me on the screen and give me a diagnosis. And it has never happened. It was impossible to happen. In the last 3 weeks, it's the only way you can see a GP. I'm looking forward to seeing my dentist for a checkup in the next couple of weeks online as well. And I'm saying that these are where the innovations are going to happen, because we're starting to realize that these models that we've talked about for some time, the defamiliarization of our current environment has made them suddenly accessible. And it's very interesting in that all the reports and all the analysis I've seen in the 10 years about how you have to gradually make these changes happen, they've all happened in 6 weeks, and they're not going backwards. So I'm going to leave it there, Amber, for a second. That's quite a discourse I've brought you through. There's lots of charts in the background explaining the rationale besides some of that analysis, but I'm conscious of time. And I would say that to the audience, please remember that we're in a very difficult economic period. We're in a very difficult human period. It is a humanitarian issue. It's not a war. It's a humanitarian issue. But that at these moments, that's typically when the innovation level is the highest. It's typically when the receptiveness to ideas is greatest.
Colm, thank you so much. This is super useful. And just to touch base, to conclude that part and open the second topic we're talking about today, Colm and I were chatting before, and we're talking about how innovation is going to affect multiple industries and how governments are going to react. One of the examples Colm mentioned is the airlines. And I gave also an example of financial services. But governments are today in a situation where they have two options: either bail out different sectors, airlines, financial services, ultimately, because that will flow through the cycle of the economy and come back to it. Help, obviously, healthcare and other sectors. And what is deemed to be a national asset and what is deemed to be a commercial asset that you can basically privatize. That experience we had in 2008. And if you remember, a lot of European countries privatized airlines, privatized or allowed acquisitions of major airlines by foreign investors. They allowed acquisitions of banks or majority stakes in banks. And all of this came to be under the radar and facing a ton of scrutiny at the moment. Those were not wise decisions from government and popularity perspective, and governments are exploring how can we transform this. The second thing is when you have something, you stress test it to make sure that it's not only working in good days, but also in more challenging times. Banks do that all the time. They check their capital adequacy and they run stress tests to make sure they have enough resources. But I think the highest tested industry during these times has been obviously healthcare. The thing with healthcare is there's a big shift towards, at least in the US, towards more commercialization. And how do we, if you look at the state of the infrastructure, we have so many closures of rural hospitals and moving a lot of the specialized services back into urban areas. This is a time we are seeing from conversations with partners, clients, portfolio companies across the board. We're seeing so much focus on how companies are reshaping their models and their offerings to be able to weather the next big event, and how do we face future challenges through digitization. Speaking of digitization, I'm going to hand it over to my dear friend Magdalena Dziewguć. She's, as I said earlier, she's a thought leader on digital transformation. She runs Central European operations for Google, Google Cloud, Google Enterprise previously, and she's done that throughout her career. She's a serial entrepreneur. Magda, welcome. Thanks for joining us today, and the floor is yours.
Thank you again for the invitation, and thank you, Colm, for all you said. I kept on noting down many points where I agree, and I will repeat what you said, probably from the digital side of the globe. So if you can, Amr, please move to my slides, and I'll be asking you to switch them. Yeah, I think.
Yes, and for everyone, just maybe people that just joined, feel free to ask questions. I think the process is you need to raise your hand or post a comment, and Dina will interrupt us to ask questions. So please be as engaged as you would like to.
I was already introduced to all of you, but I'll stop at the slide for a while, because what I'm trying to tell you through this slide is actually that the most important thing about me is that I actually went through digital transformation myself. I call myself digital immigrant. Like probably many of you in the future, you will also have to jump into the boat, and actually the ocean is already at your door. So not much time actually to pack. Why is it important? Because as Colm has said, you have to leave a lot behind you. And actually all the thing you've learned so far is a ballast that you actually have to drop. And it's a very difficult experience. And it was one of the hardest in my career when around 6 years ago, I decided to go to digital world, coming from, I call it post MBA world. We've been through this MBA business models for many years. That was the excellence of operations for many, many years. And now this MBA business model is outdated. So you have to jump into the boat, go to the digital part of the globe. And the important thing is it's already here. I think the one thing that you see is that there are not much traditional business forms. Because if you've seen the kid's story called Shrek, one of the things that happens to you when you're moving to the digital world, it's like with the layers of onion. You have to leave those layers one after another until you expose your true self, your authentic self, and only then you're allowed to get into the digital world. So let's move to the next slide. And actually, last time I saw Amr, he was at one of those amazing reunions at Harvard when actually the president of the university, Professor Faust, opened her opening lecture with that question, what's going on? And since that, it's my favorite question, because again, just a couple years later, we're asking ourselves what's going on, and nobody knows. And even though that we have many predictions and there are many discussions now about post-COVID scenarios, they are as probable as not probable. It's a big moment of uncertainty, and we are all wondering what would the world be like. And I think yesterday was one of the most dramatic moments of this situation. If you could move, Amr, to the next slide. I don't know if any of you had a chance to watch the concert, the live concert that actually Andrea Bocelli was giving yesterday night from the empty Cathedral of Milano. It was actually a heartbreaking moment. If you've seen his concert in the past, he is actually very engaging, very positive person with a lot of guests on stage, and actually audience love his concert. He was completely alone. And whom do we see? We see actually a blind singer that is a multimillionaire that is actually praying in the empty cathedral for hope for the whole world. And I think this moment is like science fiction for many of us, almost impossible. But what also is happening behind, a couple of millions of people from all around the world connected on YouTube to watch the concert. And even though it was digital, many people cried, many people shared their emotions in social media, many people were watching it together, even though they were like in different locations. So we can see that actually, even though we are distanced, we're closer. There are some amazing things happening. We're going back to our emotions. We are going back to the true reasons why we actually exist. And it's becoming okay, because for many years it wasn't. And we were actually trying to pose more than actually express our true feelings. So I think that dramatic song of Andrea Bocelli yesterday was a sign that something has changed forever. If you can, Amar, move to the next slide. And as Winston Churchill said many years ago, we see the crisis, but I'm talking to you from a Google perspective, so you see this quote on a t-shirt. And my job today is actually to encourage you to put on that t-shirt and actually try to live with that perspective. As Colm said, we're not going back to the past. Even if it will take 3 months, 9 months, 2 years, life will never be the same again. Everything will be different. So this crisis is for something, and this crisis is giving you the opportunity to reinvent everything you do in your business, in your personal life. You suddenly got a lot of time to think about it. If there was something characteristic to the last 20 years, I even had this very often on my public speeches. Every day is faster. And this is the slowest day of the rest of your life. But actually, suddenly, we stopped. And we got this additional time to think and to ask ourselves very difficult questions. Questions we were trying to avoid. Questions that we didn't want to ask ourselves. And actually being busy helped us not asking ourselves this question. So now we got this crisis and we cannot afford to waste it. We need to use this crisis to rethink, reinvent, change the things that we used to do in the past. If we could move on forward to the next slide. And everyone—
Magdalena, I just want to stop you for a second here and highlight some of the issues you're addressing. Those are things that are super important and affecting multiple layers of our lives. And I think one way to look at it is if you look at the three components of the individual, and then the corporate world, and then the government as a whole, and then the world, 4 different layers of the globe. First, at the highest level, nobody realized how connected and interconnected the world is. We spoke about that earlier, and we said that one tiny local community in China basically was able to transfer a virus to source there, or at least what's believed. It could be something else. The point being, wherever that started in one tiny little place with one person somewhere around the globe is today in every single country within days. So the global connectivity is a fact, and is it's something that we are going to live with for the rest of our existence. I think instead of challenging it, we need to find the best and most efficient ways to go through that globalization. It's happening. It's never going to reverse course. And I think a lot of the question marks that came up on what governments were doing and addressing globalization. How do we look at our own population versus the others? How do we look at our own people versus the others became irrelevant today with something like that, because even if you have somebody across the globe, like on the other opposite of the globe, like their well-being is as important as your own people. That's one quick comment. The second is, what does it mean? What are the priorities? If you look at the mostly post-World War II, but usually after major events like that, countries and governments go back to the race of arms. And if you see the biggest spending by all governments, the highest budget element has been defense. Today, there's a huge question mark that wars over the past 60 years cost tens and tens of trillions of dollars. And within 2 weeks, we get one virus that takes away more lives than the past 60 years of wars that happened. And when I say wars, I'm talking about like we've killed millions and millions by using those weapons. I'm talking about the governments that are initiating, that are spending, like the US military, how many people they lost, and other countries that have engaged in defense or in wars, how many people they lost from their own. This is what I mean by the numbers in comparison. The second is the healthcare question. The healthcare as a specific sector, how ready we are for something like that, and how do we look at healthcare and education. If we are moving into digital world, we're talking about educated people. Is education a basic right, or it's a voluntary thing? How do we look at the globe and address that from a digital perspective? If we want to create a global marketplace, we need everyone to have the ability to join that marketplace. How do we look at education from that perspective? The second is healthcare. When we have healthcare as an elective, basically, and you have multiple countries, but I think in the US this is one of the major points of debate. Is healthcare a right for everyone, or is healthcare an elective? And how do governments approach that? And what does it mean for the rest of the world, not only us? Magda, back to you. I just wanted to give a couple of comments in light of your previous slide, which I thought was very, very enlightening.
I think the word that is actually happening here, and it's hard to actually judge who's going to win this war, is actually the war between liberalism and socialism. Because what we see right now is that countries that had much more social attitude, like Denmark, New Zealand, my favorite that Colm already mentioned, or Denmark or Sweden, countries where actually, as you said, healthcare is a right, not a privilege. It's a right of every human being, and every human being is respected. These countries are not struggling with COVID-19 as much as actually the most liberal countries. Those most liberal countries where actually healthcare was just for those who can afford it. This is where we see people losing lives without appropriate attention and the appropriate respect. And the key question, I'm going back to this sad moment in front of the cathedral, is this right? Is this how we actually want to design this world? Because actually we are meeting here as leaders, people who actually have influence and who can impact how this world will be looking like. Is this what we wanted? Is this what we accept? Is this actually okay with our values and missions? And I think this is the big question to the leaders of this world. And this is the question that also people are asking themselves when they're looking at their politicians, when they're looking, when they're hearing to their words and how they actually cope with this crisis. And I think the most dramatic actually icon of this crisis is actually Prime Minister of UK, and Colm can actually say more about it. But what happened to Boris Johnson is like a Bible story. I mean, this guy was in front of his nation saying, well, economy is more important. We're not going to stop the economy. Some people will die. And he almost died. And he almost died. Is this the same thing for him right now? Colm, can you comment on this?
I think I would take, this was the point that I was making earlier on, Magda, but you've illustrated in a very interesting way. The point I was making earlier on about the inversion of understanding of value within an economy, which is happening right now. So I want to, by the way, I have now that he's safe, I would like to report that the The ICU unit that the Prime Minister of England was in was called Karma. And the reason that I call it Karma was that 2 years ago, as Minister for the Foreign and Commonwealth Office, Boris Johnson voted against a pay rise for NHS staff on the basis that they were the most inefficient and ineffective staff within the country. And I'm hoping that they didn't take the opportunity to remind him of this factor. But I think the reality of where we're coming to here is actually, Magda, we've been overtaken by events. I don't think it's a liberal versus conservative opinion anymore, and I will explain why in a second. By the end of this process, the governments, and I will only speak for Europe here, so I won't speak for any other country, but in Europe, I think it's fair to say that all the governments that came to power promising smaller government will leave power, no matter when it is, having the state owning the largest proportion of their economy ever. All of the UK agenda, which was completed under Margaret Thatcher, will be completely rolled back by the end of this episode. It is anticipated that the UK government will control 70% of their economy by the end of this cycle. When Margaret Thatcher left power, they only controlled 56%. My point is that I think this argument is now moot, because I think we've been overtaken by events, by the nationalization of service. What I think will be interesting to see will be the philosophy of Wond'ry. Do we need to centralize everything? Should we not disaggregate everything? Should we not work at a community level upwards, as opposed to trying to drive from the top down solutions that patently have failed to work in this occasion? So, to answer your question, Magda, I think the conversation between, if I like, conservatives and that's actually over, or will be over by the end of this cycle. We'll all be so much in debt, the state will own everything anyway. And the second part of that is, I think, what we've experienced in the UK is a lot of humbleness on behalf of the Prime Minister. And I want to make one final comment, just as a wry comment, if I could. The nurses who looked after the Prime Minister came from 3 countries: Portugal, New Zealand, and South America. It was, I believe, Ecuador. And the irony of that situation is he was the one who was arguing against mass immigration of these people into the NHS. So I guess he's going to have a Damascus conversion on the way. But I think it illustrates a very careful point, and I'm thankful that these slow learnings will probably change our configuration on how we understand these things in the future.
Thank you, Colm. And I actually think that what's happening, and actually COVID could have this different name, which is like lesson of humbleness for all of us. And for those of you, I keep on also repeating last days that for those of you who know the story of the Babel Tower, I actually think this is what we see again. It's like during last 70 years after the Second World War, actually people became so selfish and absolutely sure that we are great, we're amazing, you know, nothing impossible, and we own the world and we rule the world. And actually this cult of individual person became bigger than ever. And now we see that actually, even if you're Andrea Bocelli, even if you are Boris Johnson, even if you're Angela Merkel, actually you can get sick absolutely in the same situation and as any other person in the world, and you are helpless if other people will not help you. You need other people to help you, and you need to rely on these other people. So this is a huge lesson of humbleness. But moving now to the right, because I believe that as many old time.
Before we move on, we've got a couple questions that have come in the chat, so I'd like to get to those real quick before we move on. So the first is, and we've talked about, you know, things are not going back to normal, what we had before. So how do you see trade shows, medical conferences, those sources that have been so valuable for people to connect and meet new people and find opportunities? Where are we going to see that going? And then I've got a second one after that.
I actually think, you know, Google is working in a digital space, and actually it's our main workplace. But we're also famous for our offices that are actually built as an option for employees, but they are loved by the employees. So I actually think the whole world will move that direction, that actually office will be an option, but the option that people love, because we actually these days see that digital is not an alternative. It's just efficient form, but not the only form in which we will be working, because we love to spend time together. We love to actually do all these things that Colm said are now forbidden, like even smelling each other, shaking hands, actually touching our faces, hugging each other. And actually emotions are a very important part of business decisions. So we can sense those emotions much better when we are negotiating in one room than actually when we are negotiating with the screen. So I think all these things will come back even stronger and will be much more appreciated. I think there will be less empty conferences where people just pay for time, space, and they are doing blah, 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 and nobody is listening to them. But there will be more events where actually people will be interacting with each other and networking. Amr, you want to add something?
Yes, just a quick comment on that. And this is more for just imagine the future of that and put yourself through the experience of, okay, I have a conference in 3 weeks. What do I do? Just think about the time wasted on planes, in hotels, the cost of all of that. You're going into a huge location. You're probably connecting with 5,000 or joining 5,000 people and spending 2-3 days in a conference. When you walk out the door, just think of what were the key wins for you. The key wins are you connected probably with 5 to 6 relevant people out of 5,000. You have their contacts, and now you're going to follow up and go see them in person. Just imagine that whole experience being digitized and transformed in a way where you have actually artificial intelligence, for the lack of a better description, telling you where, they know exactly your preferences and the type of people and the profiles you're looking to meet, and basically connecting you to those right people and saving you the cost, the time, the energy, and the whole challenge of going through a conference and meeting with the right people and connecting you directly to these people. And then the relevant face-to-face where you really share and interact is when you sit with them one-to-one. You can never connect and be in a crowd of 5,000 and make sense of it. It's a torture for some people, and it's fun for others, but the outcome that you're looking for from an efficiency point of view could be completely transformed. Think of that, but also think about it from all industries. Colm gave the example of healthcare, how he's doing most of his healthcare, and how that has been forced, that transformation within that sector has been forced. How much data we have that we're not using, that we're able to use to improve people's lives. Same thing for the governments. When we talk about digital transformation, it's funny that the US government is still calling for thousands of COBOL developers. COBOL is from the 60s and 70s language. And it's probably the only place it still exists is in governments, because everybody else moved on except for governments. This is changing, I think, pushing a lot of people to look back inside and think of what opportunities, business, growth, change come from things like that.
So just to conclude on this, Google is already locked down for 3 weeks. All our offices globally are closed and we're only working from home. So in a first cycle, you see increase of productivity and velocity because we are more focused. We got back all this time from commutes and all other things we did without productivity. But actually, after 3 weeks, we don't like that job that much. So we are losing the most important factor, which is engagement, which actually in a long term would actually decrease velocity and productivity. So we will probably get back to balance after all of that, with more digital, but we need to see and interact with people in real places to get those emotions which we actually need to drive and feed our motivation. So that will take me to the rest of the presentation, because the opportunity is with these reinvents. Crisis will forever kill the old world, and this is the old world. In the last years, you've been learning how to move from multi-channel to omni-channel, and when you're looking at this picture, the one on the right, 1 month ago, I think it would be still the one that most of the consulting companies would be recommending to you. This is the perfect distribution model. And actually, there is only one thing that matters on the slide, which defines the future. If you could, Amr, move to the next one. It's mobile. So if you're planning the reinventing of your business right now, you actually need to design it in a way that allows your users, consumers, everyone who interacts with you to do everything from your mobile. And actually, this is the test that Google leaders do. If we come up with a new product, whatever product it is, if you can do everything about this product from your mobile, then it's a good product. If you can't, it's not. And it actually relates to every industry right now. And as Colm said, my dream for many years was to digitalize medicine, to actually digitalize schools. And in 3 weeks in Poland, we also have telemedicine, the only option to see doctor. All the schools went digital, and kids are now having classes with their teachers online. So it is possible to do everything from your mobile, but for many years, we just didn't pay enough attention to that. So
Jest godzina 19.
it gives me a sign that we should speed up. The mobile world is coming. If we can move to the next slide. Well, we see that every single person on this world has a smartphone. Even if it's a poor person, even if it's a homeless person, usually that person has a smartphone. So this is the way to connect with your future user, future customers. Couple of advices. First thing that needs to change, and I relate here to the slide where I was introducing myself to you, you need to get rid of those layers of onion, which you are actually still wearing, if you are wearing, because there is a huge difference between employees and people. And after this crisis, you cannot afford to have employees, because employees are just giving you the skills. They are not giving you their heart. They are not giving you their engagement. They are not giving you the most important elements that rule the digital world. So for those innovations of the future, what Colm was describing, you need people. You need people, you need a team of real people who will dedicate their life to your joint activity. And one thing that is gone forever, there's nothing like work-life balance anymore. Finally, things are right. We're working as we live. Kids, pets, cooking, everything is happening on the video calls. And this is our life. We can finally see artists performing from their kitchen without makeup, without special effects. We see the through and we love it. We like it much more than actually artificial effects. It's the same about work. We don't need employees pretending, nodding, pretending they agree when they actually think nothing is right. We need real people who will engage to the future of your business. Moving on, if you could click to the next one, Amr. Only true story wins in the world next. Authenticity is the keyword. Like either you are yourself or you're gone. Internet is not tolerating fake news. Internet is not tolerating wrong products, wrong descriptions, little changes to the instructions. All of this will be spotted, and the hate of the users will come back against you. So the only thing that works is authenticity. If you can click.
On that, just 1 second to narrow it back and talk about what the impact of that means for a business owner, for an entrepreneur, for somebody that is a business executive and business leader. I think there are two ways of looking at this. When you said people, it summarizes two things. It summarizes your people within the company and your larger group of customers, stakeholders in general, investors. Today, I think we're going through a crossroad of re-evaluating all these pieces together. And I'm seeing examples within our little world of, again, clients, portfolio companies, governments. Everyone is looking at the ethical aspect of how are we addressing some of these issues. You have companies that are bringing everyone in and saying, great opportunity, how can we maximize our profitability? How can we sell, cross-sell, increase our prices, do more during this time? And there are companies that are looking at their clients and their stakeholders in general and saying, how can we get through this all together? What's the best way? And I gave the example two weeks ago, and I said some of the companies, I gave the example specifically of a Tesla producing, like converting part of their manufacturing facility and producing breathing devices. I gave the example that this probably cost them $20 million, $30 million, but if in the overall frame of things, they cannot spend enough to create the brand value that they have created just in doing the right thing. I said they're probably not doing it for those reasons, but even if they are, the lasting impact of what you do to your people and to the outside is something that will transform how the perception of companies and of governments for a very long time. I think we're lucky to have somebody like Magdalena today from a company that is super large, that's also dealing with customers and with people. And maybe like some highlights of how that experience looks like could be very valuable for everyone. The second one, I said it's to the outside world, but also to your people. Your people, if you are a company and the soul of the company is how can we maximize the profit during this time, the respect of your people to take you to the next stage and the next phase of growth is as important as anything. And this is something I'd like to send back to both actually Colm and Magdalena to talk a little bit about that. Magdalena, your experience would be very valued, and then Colm, I know, will have some additional points to make.
Well, COVID-19 is like the best filter we ever got. Like we see the leaders as they are, and we see companies as they are. All this blah, blah talk, you know, on the conferences about our missions and values is now faced with the reality. And we see it every day. Like, of course, I could speak about Google that is right now offering people in Poland, probably 10 million today celebrated Easter with the family over Hangout. Or like we're working right now on Zoom or any other tools. Like we see huge companies offering their technologies for free. But I think we also see individual leaders like Giorgio Armani stopped his production the first day of crisis, and actually all his factories are producing masks for free. And we see those amazing leaders now trying to do whatever they can to help others, and some others that disappeared. They disappeared from the first pages, and they are actually hiding somewhere in a hole, but we know that they will not be back. So both companies and individual people are actually now faced with the challenge that shows who they really are.
If I could just that, Magda, I think that's a very strong point. I think you're beginning to see which companies actually had a vision and mission that they actually believed in and who didn't. And let me just illustrate, Amber, it's interesting how we're also learning about how smaller companies behaved. I'm struck by the time, I don't know what it's like in the US, but hand sanitizers were not available for an awful long time. And distilleries, small alcohol distilleries making whiskies and gins, immediately switched over to making alcohol-based hand sanitizers, which, by the way, are not at all profitable to make if you're trying to make specialized whiskies. But they immediately converted them over. Sporting companies, very small SMEs that were in the value chain, moved to hospital garments because they understand how to stitch, etc. And so, yeah, I think to speak to Max's point, I think that's where you start to find out things about people here. I would say, and the reason I highlighted, and we didn't have enough time to go into the sectors in detail, worth looking at each sector. I think the pharma industry and some of the healthcare providers are in real trouble here because they saw this as a profit maximization stage. And actually, anybody in business will know it's not. It's a time where you sustain the gains that you've made, you prove your real value, and you build off that platform into the future. This will not go on forever. So I think you can point to industries where the behavior of those industries has shown a high degree of innovation, a high degree of flexibility, and delivering what I call real value to the real economy, because that's what the real economy needs now. And equally, I think the public will not be remiss in remembering the larger companies or other companies who did not show that degree of flexibility and did not show that effort of really being with you to the end journey. And the one thing that struck me when Magda was saying that about you have people, you don't have employees. If you have people, and we know this about customers, right? If you have customers, they expect you to be with them in the tough times as well as the good times. If you're not with them in the tough times, you lose more than when you're with them in the good times, because everybody wants to be with you in the good times. So I think there's a very important lesson coming out of this. And I'm going to leave it one last comment I've already made. The banks have proven themselves to be unworthy recipients of public trust, both now and because of what happened post-2008. And for that, I am sure they will pay a big price.
Absolutely. I just want to 1 minute to talk about this specific point, Colm, because it's a fabulous manifestation of the impact of that in the sense of strategy and business terms. Banking and healthcare are probably the least two disrupted or digitally transformed industries in the world today as we stand. Education maybe is as much, but let me take financial services or banking. If you look deeply into strategy, and this is something I discussed also with Magda when we were preparing for this call, financial services companies and banks over time have relied mostly on the physical interaction to connect it to the trust element. You've been with your bank for 20 years or 30 years and you don't leave that bank away to somebody else because you know somebody at the branch that you think is going to take care of your own money. And people find it very hard to trust new people with their money if they are comfortable, at least with the baseline minimum, doing what they are. Over the past 2 weeks, the number of mobility within banking, moving from larger banks to smaller entrepreneurial, more innovative, more digital banks, has been faster than the past years at a time. And usually when you have a trend like that starts, you can never reverse it back. Think of a lot of the innovations that were very hard to break through at the beginning for human elements and personality elements and psychological elements like trust, like associating trust with a person, into how that looked like after digitization. I think in the future, you'll find companies like Apple, and it's happening already, but you'll find companies like Google and Apple and Facebook that are doing banking, that are your banking providers and potentially your health providers, because those are the most digitally savvy companies that you trust. And all of a sudden, when that ceiling basically breaks off, or when that barrier breaks where you associate trust with the person at your bank rather than the institution itself, you're never going to go back. People are complaining, specifically in the US, about the dispersing the package that they call a stimulus package. There's nothing about it that's stimulus. It's all a rescue package for what's like a small portion of the big hit that the economy has taken. But that has had to go through the banking system and the financial services system. And the opinions and the decisions that people are making because of that one experience after 30 years and 40 years and 50 years of being with their banks has changed. And typically that is one of the lasting industries, the trust element. The second element is naturally the people with the most money are the older people because they had more time to save. And those are the least digitally ready to transform, let's say. They are making that big leap and jump because of situations like that, because we're stress testing that system. Exactly like Colm said, exactly like Magdalena has been saying also throughout this call.
Yeah, so if you can move us to the next slide, we're slowly running out of time. So the previous one. Yes, probably if you saw that slide 3 months ago, you would be thinking that this is about what you share on LinkedIn or Twitter or Facebook. But I think these days we are understanding this completely different. And this is all the truth about the leaders. Like, if you want to be the leader of the digital world, you are what you share. And what you share in all those social media has to be what you actually share in reality. So the meaning of sharing has changed. And it's not only about the number of likes and the number of people following you and your profile, but it's actually about the real impact that actually you have made to other people's life. So if we can go forward, on the next slide, I'm showing you a recipe for success in digital world. All the digital leaders, the unicorns, the digital natives, as we call them, that are successful are sharing this. First of all, as Colm already said, the only thing that matters is talent, real human talent, because this is what other people cannot copy, they cannot program, they cannot download. And actually, I think Google was one of the first companies that went all around the globe to identify talented people of all kinds and encouraging those people to join Google. And I think many others in digital world are also only focusing on acquisition of talent, because this is the competitive advantage of the future. If you have talented people, everything is possible. If you just bought some skills, you're in troubles. And it's time to change the policy of hiring. The second thing which is important is experience. It's not about having people who are like 20 plus in sneakers and t-shirts. It's about having experience. Nothing, no software can actually replace experience. The way you assess risk, the way you take decision, the way you solve conflicts, the way you sense people's emotions, the way you understand complexity of the issues comes from your experience. And you have to go through a number of projects to be efficient. And this is what you have to take into account. So not only talent, but diversity in the team. Diversity from the age perspective, diversity from the background perspective, because this is how your customer base looks like. Your customer base is diverse, and to understand and reach out the maximum of its customer base, you need to make sure that your talent meets experience that is diverse. Last thing is this social impact. The purpose, the mission, the authenticity. You do something because you believe it's worth your time, not just to earn money. I mean, companies that are just for money, they are gone. They will vanish. Like, we are now seeing that social mission, the engagement, the passion, and the real story behind producing something will matter more and more. And all of that is on the background of data, because dashboard is the main tool of every leader. Every talent has access to the data, and actually there's no business without data. In the future, now, I think the future is happening now, we see that even all the tracking of people who are potentially exposed to COVID is now moving to data. We are teaching the society that data can be positive, data can save your life, data can help you protect other people. And actually the whole thing about privacy is redefining, especially in Europe right now, as we are moving very fast to the digital world. There will be a lot of legal challenges connected, but there will be no future without data anymore. If we can move to the next one.
Just a quick thought, Magdalena, on that, and I have a point also for Colm. Just going back to the talent issue, what you're saying at the level of organizations is absolutely true. The biggest change from the past is organizations are, instead of following economic development incentives and what governments are offering them as incentives, they're following talent and they're following ecosystems. This is what has been the most effective driver of company relocations and expansion decisions that companies are having when they consider moving or creating new hub or new head office somewhere. They're looking at talent as the first top priority. They don't care about the incentives that governments are offering them. They're looking for an infrastructure where they can expand and live through what they need the most, which is talent, experience, as you're saying. That means that governments, instead of spending tax money on creating incentive programs for companies to join, they have to create the infrastructure of people. That's all they need to focus on to be attractive and sell that to the outside. That's a major shift that you have, that has transformed probably the world in the past 10, 12 years, I would say. There's nobody else that knows that space better than Colm. And Colm, just a couple of points, and that's my last comment. I know we have to close probably within 5-7 minutes, so I'll let you give that comment back to Magda to finish. We've just interrupted you multiple times, so just give it back to you to finish your presentation. Colm, just
well, I think Magda's summed it up perfectly. Ironically, I think it's probably fair to say, from my own perspective, the way I see it is that you have a massive equalization around the world in terms of capital access points. You know, the barriers that we would have had historically have gone. So there's no real burden of geography. So someone who's smart enough in Tunisia or Morocco or Egypt can effectively write something that works on a space shuttle. And it's all about talent. But can I just highlight what we mean by talent? It's a multi-dimensional view of talent. So it's not education in the academic sense. It's education in the broadest sense. Can you work with people? Can you listen? Can you absorb? And just let me close off with one thing around diversity. We talk a lot about diversity. Diversity is about experience, and experience can come from gender, it can come from race, it can come from life, it can come from age. We need to be very broad in our understanding of what diversity is, because generally speaking, diversity works, but it only works when it's encompassing all the facets of diversity and not a pre-programmed set of diversity. And I think a lot of the comments Magda has made about people is the important thing. Ironically, and I'll leave this to hand over back to Magda, one observation I'd make is that in an age where digital becomes more important, where the machine becomes essential parts of the value component, despite what the doomsayers said in the 60s and 70s, it has actually augmented the importance of people to the system as opposed to denigrated it.
I totally agree, and I will just add one more thing based on what Colm said in his initial remarks. One thing that has changed with COVID-19, what is actually a standard for digital native, is this continuous assessment. We've just learned with COVID-19 that nothing is for granted, And actually in the digital world, nothing is for granted. I mean, what you do as a leader, what your business does, will be continuously assessed via data. Data, online connections, insight coming instantly from number of interactions in the digital world will continuously assess the quality of your service, of your product, of your interaction. And nothing will be for granted. That's why I say the only thing that you need to provide to your experienced, talented, socially responsible people is dashboards, good dashboards, because if they get good access to the data, they will know what to do. And they will keep on improving your business. So in the next slides, I think we can skip the next three. I'm just trying to show you that some companies actually were prepared for today. And I'm thinking these days about those CXOs, which actually kept on telling me digital transformation. Yeah, we've hired a consulting company for this. Yeah, it is on our agenda. It is in our strategy, but they actually never perform digital transformation. They are in troubles today. But companies that actually perform digital transformation earlier, they are the winners in this crisis, and they will be the giants of the economy of next 10 days. And if you could move forward, we've been tracking them. We know that already they were bringing more revenues and better results in profitability and market valuation. This will just hyperscale now. And with everything we see in capital markets, the shift will be very visible, and those who actually perform digital transformation will actually benefit in the next months, years from those activities. All others need to catch up, and it has to be super fast. So I want to actually, if you could just move forward, leave you with actually a quote from a Nobel Prize winner in poetry, Wisława Szymborska, because I think we do not speak enough about culture. And culture is the winner of COVID-19. Culture will not be a niche, and culture shows its importance this day, when actually we as people, as the whole world, humanity, need to connect around our emotions about things that are unique, but also universal. So this quote speaks about the fact that this day will be gone, and the only thing that matters is tomorrow. And we need to think about tomorrow more than actually about today, and completely forget the ballast from the past. And if you can move to the next slide, I want to encourage you to make a lot of plans, make a lot of detailed plans, agendas. I mean, the more plans you make, the more you will feel like there is future for you, and those plans will keep your head above the water, and those plans will actually help you hold to this future and believe that you're part of the future. We need to move out of the world of the past, because it's gone. It's gone. It will be a nice memory, but we need to adjust, prepare, be agile, and be ready for the world of the future. And that's my final remark.
Magdalena, thank you so much. Colm, thank you so much. It's been an honor to have you both today. I know Colm will be coming back in the future on some of those, and I definitely will be very closely in touch with Magdalena. Please follow us on Twitter and LinkedIn, the Wond'ry and Lodestone Advisory Group, to keep track of the next sessions. We will have the posts in the next couple of days. Usually we're having a weekly event on Monday at 11. I know today is a holiday for many of you, so for whom of you that were not able to attend today because of the Easter holiday, happy Easter, and I know it will be online, so you'll be able to watch it and join us next week. Dina, thank you so much for hosting and for having us today as usual. Thanks for your help. Thanks everyone for attending. And I will leave it, Dina, to you to close.
Yeah, and as we're closing, one question that we had come in that I thought if we could take just a second to address is, we have several educators that are on the line, and one of the things that they've been thinking about is the effects that this is going to have on the different models in the education industry. So both higher ed as well as K-12, and wanting to know just your quick kind of thoughts on how you see this impacting the education industry.
Well, I would refer to the founder of Digital University with me on the call, Magdalena Dziewguć. Please go ahead, and then Colm as well.
I think the education has just not passed the exam, and has actually proved that the system was not preparing people for the current situation. So I think in the future, as Colm said, there will be much more continuous assessment, much less grades or certificates that will actually define the opportunities for people. And I also think people will be building their experience, and this experience will be much more counted, like there will be digital evidence for everything you do. So just passing one exam as in the past will not be the ticket for the future. I mean, your digital life will be your whole life, with all the mistakes and with all the risks you have taken, and also with all the wins that you had. So the digital evidence as continuous assessment will be much more important than grades or certificate. That's my opinion.
Well, I think that's very well put. Actually, I think the two sectors that have not advanced well enough in the last 60 years, frankly, are healthcare and education. And I know why, and it's unfortunately why. It's been a vested interest program. But I think, Magdalena, just reflect on your comments and say, education will be more broadly defined in the future. I think it has to be. It won't simply be about functional knowledge. It will also be about how you handle situations, how you deal with risk, how you address situations, how you deal with diversity, all these aspects of absorption. And we don't measure those today, and you're about to find out how we're going to measure them in the future. The functional part, I think, doesn't need to be dealt with face to face. Many of the other aspects will. So I think there's a lot of changes about to come down the cycle. And can I just segue, Amber, into one last comment, because I really think this is a really important thing. Magda's raised the issue of data consistently. And we've struggled with data over the last couple of years. And I made a comment earlier on about the fact that anytime we achieve anything in the world of humanity, it's always scientific in nature. Now, the reality is data is the manifestation of science. Data is about, science is about, can I measure it? Can I see it? Can I factually record it? And here's a message I would leave everybody to. Today will end. I think, Magdalena, thank you for ending with a poet, because the poets are mirrors of the future. But it will end, and the way we'll get out of this is by understanding how we got into it, what has been happening, and the data pathways that will tell us. So science will get us out of this. And it hasn't been just a battle of socialist versus capitalist that has been at fraught here. It's actually been a battle for the heart of science, and data is a manifestation of that. And those who haven't followed a scientific approach are the ones who are going to pay the biggest price. And if you want a personal example of that from Europe, just look at the numbers between Germany and the UK right now. And at that stage, if there was any justice in the world, the UK government, current government, should be held accountable for the needless death of 7 people year to date. So I think we've got to go back to understanding, and education will have to go back to understanding, that science is the origin of all good human emotions.
That's wonderful. Dina. Yeah, so as Amr mentioned, first of all, just thank you so much for joining us and spending this time with us. Amr, Magda, Colm, this was fantastic. So many just wonderful quotes coming out of today that are going to stick with me. Just one of those being, Magda's, if you have talented people, everything is possible. That's exactly what we're all looking for right now, and it's going to drive us through this next wave of innovation. But with that, as Amr mentioned, the video will be up shortly after the session ends on the Wond'ry website, and then we'll also put the slides up from the session. And if you have any follow-up thoughts or questions that you want to ask, just reach out to us at the wond'ry@vanderbilt.edu email account, and I'll be happy to take those. But thank you so much for spending this time with us today. Bye, everyone.
Thank you. Bye.